Thank you for joining us for the third of our Garrod seminars on organic archaeology's wetland futures. This evening we're really happy to welcome Dr Hannah Fluck from the National Trust, where she is the Senior National Archaeologist. Previously, I'm aware that she led the climate strategy at Historic England, and a long time ago, back in the Middle Pleistocene, was a PhD student at the University of Southampton. I'm sure that summary misses out a huge wealth of experience along the way. But this evening, she's going to share with us some practical insights from her work at the National Trust with the title, Digging Deep, Does Archaeology Matter in Peatland Restoration? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and actually Jodie, who's lurking at the back there, was back in that deep Pleistocene past with me at Southampton as well. Yeah, as Rachel said, I have a bit of a backstory with peat. I also led the Historic England work with DEFRA on the England Peat Action Plan, which I think you may... So you heard from Ben last week, and embarrassingly I didn't manage to make it to actually listen to what he said, but our lives have overlapped quite a lot in trying to just generally raise the profile of the historic environment and archaeological interest in peatland work and peatland restoration over the years, just to make sure that it's bloody recognised as something that should be considered. And it sounds quite obvious, and you're sat in one of the centres of excellence for thinking about soggy archaeology, but actually for an awful lot of people it's not even something that occurs to them. So what I wanted to do today was to give you a little bit of an overview of how we are starting to approach things at the National Trust and thinking about where archaeology and the skills that we have fit into responding to the climate and nature crisis with a particular peaty focus. But also I wanted to challenge you a bit to think about how you and your experience and expertise as archaeologists, I'm going to make an assumption that most of you at least have an interest in that or know some archaeologists, can really stretch yourselves to start to make a bit of a difference and to reach out to some of these other sectors that we have to work closely with. As Rachel said, I have an academic background as a Pleistocene archaeologist. I've worked in local authority archaeology as a planning archaeologist. That was probably my first encounter with dealing with people that really don't care and how you try and persuade them. And then I sort of somehow found myself involved in climate change and increasingly in that overlap between nature and archaeology. And that's sort of what I spend most of my time doing at National Trust, as well as providing general specialist support for I think we have about 13 archaeologists working across our regions and delivering that work. So anyway, I also... Now, is this going to work? Oh, it's the wrong... Oh, gosh. Wrong thing. I've got to do that one. Okay, cool. That could have been a disaster, couldn't it? Oh, is it
The cursor.
The cursor. I'm clearly not equipped to... We had a moment when we weren't even sure if I was going to be able to download this, so hence my pile of props here, because that's the alternative talk that I do. Aha, there you go. So some of you might know the National Trust, some of you might think you know the National Trust. I thought I knew the National Trust before I started working there about 2.5 years ago. So we are a charity and membership organisation. We're the largest conservation charity in Europe. We're also, I think it's the largest private landowner in the UK. We own or care for 250,000 hectares of land. Now, what a lot of people don't know is that about half of that land is actually tenanted. So other people live on it, work on it, farm it. And we have varying degrees of control or influence over what people can do on that land. So there's an awful lot of our work is actually about trying to influence and engage those people who are working, farming, caring for our land with us. We have an awful lot of coastline and what most people probably think of us for, a lot of historic houses, parks and gardens, and also quite a number of nature reserves, including Wick and Fen, which you will hear a little bit more about in a moment. We have a lot of peatland in our care. We I quite like this statistic. Our peatlands in England and Wales hold 2% of the total carbon in the UK in soil and vegetation. It's quite impressive, really, for a single organisation. We are really dedicated to delivering better environment for nature, to reducing carbon emissions, and our commitment to deliver net zero is something that we take very seriously. And we also have a new strategy that some of you might have seen. No, that's my computer. That's not going to work, is it? Which will take us over the next 10 years, which is about how we're going to commit to restoring nature, not just in our places, but with partners outside our borders, ending unequal access to nature, beauty and history, and inspiring millions more people to care and take action. So that's kind of runs through our core. And you might see a few of those strands of things that I'll try and pick up as I go through. So we are very much not just about heritage. We're not just about archaeology. Archaeology is a very small part of what we do. And the overall thrust and drive of our new strategy is ensuring that we have a world which is rich in nature and fit for the future and enjoyed by as many people as possible. Octavia Hill was one of our founders. It wouldn't be a National Trust presentation if I didn't have a quote from Octavia. If you don't know very much about her, go and look her up. She was pretty awesome, actually. So what her drive was about sharing that nature, beauty and history with ordinary people, and that's again underpins who we are and what we do. So peat, I've mentioned we own a lot of it, but I'm sure most of you have heard this already in this series, but peat is really important. It's really important because, not just because peat sequesters carbon, but when it's eroding, it's emitting carbon. So the erosion and poor quality of the peat on our land is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, emitter of carbon emissions for the National Trust. So we need to get it in a healthy condition. It's also really important for biodiversity and wetland species, and it also helps improve water quality and reduce flood risk. I think something like 40 times its weight in water that good quality, healthy peatlands can hold, which is pretty critical when you look at the climate risks that we're facing with increased intensity and rainfall. And then also we're concerned about the loss of the archaeological and paleoenvironmental record that's contained within, under and on the peat. So peatland restoration is a priority for us, and we're working extensively with a number of partners. It is primarily with partners because of the scale of the challenges that we faced. And then there's a sort of wider context in which we're working. So a lot of the work on peat is funded through various schemes that come from government to encourage a commitment to restore peatland. Now that has been through the Nature for Climate Peatland Restoration Grant, I think I've got that right, in England, which is overseen by Natural England. The Landscape Recovery Scheme is picking up a lot of that for a combined thinking about nature recovery at scale across landscapes. But this document, the England Peat Action Plan, was one that myself and Zoe Hazel at Historic England and some others in Natural England and other organisations worked very hard to try and ensure that a historic environment and cultural heritage was recognised within that, which it is. It's also recognised in IUCN Peatland Code, which is referenced at the bottom, which now has specific reference to the importance of thinking about and including heritage in your peatland restoration. So we have a nice bundle of things saying that it matters. Some of them come with some money to do something about the archaeology, because that's quite important because we can't work for free. So against all that, it all looks kind of rosy. It's also worth reflecting on what we're talking about when we're talking about the historic environment with peat, because you have the stuff on the surface. So a lot of the time that might be recent military remains. It's quite common, especially in some of our upland areas, industrial activities. We've got the stuff within the peat itself, whether that's deliberately deposited material, whether that's accumulations of remains of settlements, trackways, that kind of thing. And we've got the remains below the peat, so those layers prior to that peat formation, which is usually where I start to get excited, because you get nice lots of Pleistocene gravels and things like that. And then you have the paleoenvironmental record, which is not just within the peat, it's also in those deposits below the peat, which are the preservation which is aided by the presence of the peat. And then there's the cultural heritage aspects of the peatlands, the folklore, the song, the sort of myths and legends, the character and local distinctiveness. No two bogs are the same, but if you don't spend too long looking at them, you might not notice that. There's some brilliant, one of my favourite PT experiences was up in Scotland. There's a PhD student up there doing soundscapes. Her name's Lizzie, and I can't remember her last name. And she had placed little speakers around a settlement in the Glencoe area that included someone singing a Gaelic song about a water bull stealing a woman off into the bog. And it's quite evocative. You could imagine someone kind of there cooking some dinner and singing a song about being dragged off by the water bull. And we were all a little bit wary when we went around the boggy areas. But there's a lot of richness in that heritage of these places as sort of cultural points of reference. And, you know, you're sat in the middle of the fens. You don't need to know that, be told that. So it's also important. So in terms of peatland restoration, but also in terms of how we think about the heritage, there is a difference between lowland and upland peat. So I just to kind of reflect on that a bit. So the history of peat and its exploitation in the lowlands is one of shrinkage, of draining for, you know, reclaiming that land for agricultural use, intensive agricultural use for those rich peaty soils, as well as extraction. This is, I think, possibly my favourite cultural artefact ever, the Holm Post, which was banged into the ground to indicate the depth of peat before people started reclaiming that land and using it for agriculture. And that is the amount of peat of ground that has been lost in. I'm looking for someone who'll be able to give me precise. I'm a Paleolithic archaeologist. I do give or take 1 million years. So, but it's in a century, I think, isn't it, or something like that? Well, yeah. So it's an extraordinary indication of the level of change for this landscape. In terms of interest, again, I mean, there's plenty of people in the audience who can explain in better detail the sorts of things, extraordinary things that we find here. But settlements, trackways, those buried land surfaces, that deep time paleo landscapes, both under and under the peat, that archaeology of the exploitation of peat itself, and that record of change over time, as well as all those other cultural references. And in terms of the impact on the archaeology, we've got the desiccation of the peat, the changing water levels, which affect the chemistry of the context in which things are preserved, and the changing soil chemistry from relation to land use, as well as the erosion and the actual loss of peat, mainly through agricultural practices or removal. And I think it's safe to say, although it may not always feel like it, the archaeology of lowland peat is probably better understood and better investigated in many ways than upland peat. And what we sometimes find... it was working. I can only use the... There you go. And the upland peat... I think there's also an assumption that what you find in the uplands is going to be it's kind of the same. It's peat, so you get the same sorts of things there. And it's really not. It's in both instances that archaeological understanding of thinking about a landscape, about how that land form, about the environment in which people were living and working and playing is very much part of how you would understand the distribution of archaeological sites. And in the uplands, you've got often quite big differences between very shallow peat, where it's eroding off the edge of very hard rocky areas, and then very deep pockets of peat, and slightly different history of that extraction and exploitation, often focusing on extraction. We got burning, so these are images from some assessments that's been done on Dartmoor, indicating charcoal burning platforms called milers, probably from medieval times. We've also got a history of draining for shooting, but also grazing. So that idea of land improving the land to be able to use it, which is pretty extensive, as well as the kind of burning activities that go along with that. and industrial activity. So in Dartmoor, for instance, there's a lot of work around tin mining and tin streaming, which you can see reflected. The archaeological interest, you've got that industry of the exploitation of the mineral resources as well as the peat. You have some settlement, although it's distributed very much in different places within that landscape. You get funerary monuments, and you get the same change over time. But I think the main thing is that it's often quite underexplored. Some of these areas aren't so accessible, and there hasn't been development. So you haven't had extensive quarrying or large-scale investigations that really show the sorts of things that you might have up there, which you have in a lot of lowland areas. Obviously, you get these things everywhere, but I was trying to draw out some of the distinctions. In terms of the impacts, we've got desiccation and shrinkage of the peat and erosion, and a lot of that is extremes of weather. So poor condition peat will be eroded by heavy rainfall and wind, as well as animals, sort of poaching from hooves of grazing animals. So interestingly, a lot of these places might be managed through grazing to enable sites to be more visible. That's a thing of archaeological practice for helping manage earthwork sites. If you've got peatland, that's probably not going to help terribly much. And so you get some interesting needs to rethink perhaps what good looks like for managing places in peatland. I know, I'm not very... Aha, there you go. Right, so peatland repair. When we talk about repairing, so repairing peat's going to be good for the archaeology, right? There's loads of it in the ground. We don't always know where it is, but if it's nice and wet, then it will be all right. It's the primary objective of peatland repair is just to keep the water there long enough so that the plants can grow, and then they'll keep the water there. So a lot of the interventions, things like this, it's just different ways of keeping water on the top of a hill or on a slope or somewhere where it's otherwise been encouraged through history of land use and draining to move very quickly from that land, and we want it to stay there. So there are lots and lots of different ways of doing this, and I think every time there's a group of us, so the sort of UK Heritage Working Group for peatland that includes representatives from the different national bodies that regulate these processes, and every time we meet there's another list of some other crazy way in which people have found to keep water there. But there's bundles of heather or plant material, even just hessian or coir. We've got this one's the Wicken Fen bund that's going in at the moment, which is a really impressive kind of engineering construction at scale. Simple grips and just putting banging bits of plastic or metal in, wooden dams, and this one up here is stone. And your archaeological minds are going to be going, oh no, site formation processes from those sorts of interventions. That's going to be interesting, isn't it? So there's changes, visual changes, obviously, to that landscape, and there's also these are intrusive materials. So particularly some of that stone, you're bringing in stone that wouldn't have been there before. Is that the same as the stone that people would have been building archaeological features from, for instance? And to get those things in, most of it requires some digging. So another method is to just use the peat from the surface of the bog to fill in holes elsewhere. That's actually ecologically one of the sort of simplest ways. You just get trigger happy with a digger, you dig some holes, get some peat, lump it somewhere else to stop the water flowing down the slope. Again, that's not the sort of description of some activities that an archaeologist wants to hear when you're trying to predict what the impacts might be. So there's some examples here, sort of hand digging. I think that's in the Peak District, through to, can you get a digger in? And the tracks that they use to get diggers over these otherwise soggy areas is quite impressive. But it is intrusive works. So we need to know knowing where the archaeology is before you start doing this work is kind of important. And I think, as I said earlier, a lot of our wetland areas are perhaps under-investigated. So we don't necessarily know, and even if we did, have we reflected that in any of the data that people would ordinarily be checking? So local authorities will have historic environment records, we maintain records at National Trust, but that's the things that we know about. it's quite hard to retain records of, actually, we really think there's highly likely to be something really cool in this place that no one ever thought to do anything before, and so we can tell you about it at this later date. It's not really how our records work, so that's quite a challenge. The other thing is, the peatland restoration people are quite bad at telling you where the digging's going to be. You can often get maps where there's a nice big splodge, and you're going, well, we're going to restore, 1,000 hectares of land, and we it'll be all right because it's just on this mountain top. There's nothing there, is it? We'll do some bunding. That's all right. So that's not overly helpful. If you've ever done any planning archaeology, you want the construction of a housing development or a quarry. You want the footprint of that. You're like, right, that's your impact. We'll assess that, and then we can tell you what to do about it. And we know that the archaeology is going to be impacted in that area. For peatland, that's a lot harder to do. So it requires a different sort of conversation about why you care about where they dig and what that might look like. And then there's this final challenge as well. I don't know, any of you ever tried to watch, anyone done a watching brief? So watching brief is kind of standing there watching brief on a bit of waterlogged ground. It's really, really easy, isn't it? You're going to see a lot. So this is, exactly how you're going to mitigate whatever impact they have. Being able to see anything, if a digger's digging a small hole just to get some soil out of it, you're probably not. So thinking about what the best way to engage and intervene to make sure that we're delivering on that heritage promise of the peatland action plan and other things is not necessarily that straightforward. The other thing that happens is planting. So that's sphagnum moss. There's lots of different types of moss and all sorts of very cool plants. I forgot to get one of my favourite. There's two carnivorous plants that I really like in peat bogs. So the butterwort, which has sticky leaves and a very pretty little flower, and the one that looks like a hairbrush. I've sundew, which is like a little Venusy flytrap thing. They're very cool. I forgot to include those. So the idea is that healthy peat has healthy plants which are growing, storing all that carbon, decaying in those anaerobic conditions and building up over time. The thing is, if it works, then you get a build-up of soil over time. So that's great, right? But we've got some archaeological features that we've sort of got used to being able to see, including things like the industrial archaeology, the historic peat cuttings themselves. And for an awful lot of archaeologists, that's quite hard to get your head around, that something that's going to reduce the visibility and the legibility of some historic environment features is going to be a good thing. The counter to that is if we don't do this, those are going to erode away and they won't be there. So I tend to think of it as an archaeologist, it's still there, it's just buried. If you were to dig a section across that, you'd be able to see it. That evidence is retained. But it is quite a challenge for a lot of people to think about that change and loss of visibility as a result of healthy peatland and planting. So those are the methods. The other thing that's really important is that this happens at a massive scale. So this thing that looks like dragon scales, that's just a tiny section of an aerial photograph of a restored peatland. Each of those is probably, a couple of metres across. Now, that's quite a massive intervention in that landscape. You can see here, this is sort of panoramic. I think that's the phase one of the Dartmoor project that I'll talk about in a moment. This you can see there's the erosion scars of eroding peat, but further up here, actually the PowerPoint things cut it off. There's some of these things here that are just preventing the water kind of running down fast and continuing to erode it. But the point is, this is at massive scale. And it's really challenging to get your head around that, because even really big road schemes or pipelines or housing schemes, you have a clearer idea of that impact. You've got nice zones about what's going to be, some phasing to it. These sorts of things that happen in this, with all those methods that I was talking about at that scale, where you've got zones where you may or may not be digging some holes, and you may or may not know what archaeology is there, is very challenging. And the other point is, in those other sort of development-led contexts, you've got a clear polluter. Someone's wanting to make a profit by building some houses to sell them. They're going to have an impact. It's quite right that the polluter pays principle underpins a lot of that. With peatland restoration, it's in all our interests. This is something that isn't necessarily going to turn a profit. A lot of the time this is being done with public money for public good. The impact is also not quite, it's not the same as building a road through it. These are little bits and pieces of impact. And so how to respond at an appropriate scale in terms of thinking about that archaeological impact is quite a challenge. And this is, just a slide. I did a talk for CIFA on green skills, and I stole this back from that presentation. But it's not the same as thinking about development. And for a lot of us who've worked in that development management context, it's really hard to shift that mentality. And I think for those working in research, also the ways in which that research then feeds into these sorts of activities is therefore a little different. It's not governed by the same regulations and markets. It's not the criteria under which you get funding for archaeological work and peatland intervention are not the same as the ones through MPPF and planning regulations. It falls slightly short of what you'd expect in those situations. So quite often as a National Trust, we're topping up money that we'd get through the funding schemes with other sources of funding, which you'll see in a minute. The impacts aren't quite the same. It's not a wholesale loss of chunks of deposit and landscape. And the benefits are just overwhelmingly good for society and people, and no one's kind of turning a massive profit from it. There are, there's biodiversity net gain and carbon credits and things. There might be, exceptions, but as a rule, this is something we need to happen. So thinking differently as archaeologists about how archaeology then integrates with those schemes is what I'm sort of asking people to start to do. So this is sort of my reality, I suppose. So when you start to talk to people who are tasked with delivering these big changes that deliver for nature, for climate, in those overwhelming waves of the biodiversity and nature crisis, we get these sorts of responses. Why are you here? Why are you relevant? You're not relevant. It's not about you. Those kind of responses you get from tree planting taking landscapes back to their original state. Well, I mean, there's so much to unpick in that, really, isn't there? What's the relevance? This is about what we need to do for the future. Like, you're all about past things that are dead. How is that relevant? I love that one in yellow. That hurts. If the historic environment is detrimental to nature, it's no longer relevant. Wow. Okay. We slow down land restoration. It's just this was another of my favourite, talking about data. But your data, it's just opinions, isn't it? It's not real. That idea of narrative-based decision making. It's not evidence. Why does it matter? If I can't see it, why does it matter? That was a really interesting conversation with someone working at one of our places, which is incredibly rich in prehistoric archaeology. And she was saying, but I just can't get my head around how something that I just can't see could matter that much. And you're thinking, gosh, okay, so as archaeologists, how does that make you feel? Because that makes me go, oh, yeah, okay, got a little bit of a case to make. So despite all of that kind of context for that, recognition within the peat action plan, some of this was what we were up against when we were talking to DEFRA, just to get that little recognition. This is what people are really thinking. And you turning up into that context, it's not about us. and it's quite hard to do a rapid reframing instead of going in going, okay, so you already care about all this stuff, and I'm just going to tell you how we're going to get the most out. It's all exciting, and everyone loves archaeology. And you're like, oh shit, that's changed things a little. I should bring in some of my objects. I always travel with top trumps. So this is like the opposite of the top trump. So there's Indy, and then there's awesome animals. Now we all know that Indy's going to beat the awesome animals in this kind of context, but actually this is the sort of reality of the top trumps between Indy and the awesome animals. Indy is not winning. that particular conversation. So, so then, how is archaeology, and whose job is it to make it relevant? Spoiler alert, it's your job. It is not, no one's ever going to go, oh, damn it, what I really need is an archaeologist. Even a world of increasing Nazis, and no one's gone, hey, Indy, come on, archaeologists, you know what to do. So we have to make ourselves relevant, and we have to reach out to explain what we can do to help. And I want us to start to think about that idea of, we're quite good at that, safe in that, you're going to dig a hole here and that's going to do harm to a thing I care about, and you need to do this to compensate for that, to mitigate for that harm. And I want us to shift away from that. I think of it as almost apologetic, that kind of, can we be more than mitigation? Because I think we can, and I think that's where it gets really exciting. And more than that, I think we kind of have to. I must admit, I'm not watching the news very much at the moment. I think most of us are probably hiding. The kind of conversations about changes in planning, and the hard time that Newts and Bats got in that. We all know that it's only because no one thought about archaeology that we weren't in there as well. But we have to be more than mitigation if we're going to be relevant. And I think we've got a lot to offer. So anyway, that's the doom and gloom. So at National Trust, we've started trying to think in light of some of those comments. So those comments all have come, sort of paraphrased a few, but I've encountered all of those in the 2.5 years that I've been working at National Trust. A couple of them also reflected in what work I was doing as head of environmental strategy at Historic England. But all of this has sort of led to thinking about how can we start to reframe what we do, so that when we undertake these assessments, which various regulations say we need to undertake, we need to do environmental impact assessments that need to include heritage. We need to think about the heritage within the peatland restoration schemes. And so we've devised an approach that we're testing. I also think life's too short for waiting for something to be perfect, so we've just sort of put it out there. And I'm happy to share with anyone that wants to take a look. Feedback, welcome. And we've developed with colleagues in South West and in particular, we've devised something that we're calling our Heritage Impact, it's very catchy, Heritage Impact Opportunity Scoping Assessment. Land use change for nature. We should have just tried a bit harder with that title before it stuck. But anyway, hiatus. The idea is that this is sort of turning on its head the desk-based assessment approach, or the kind of assessment approach that a lot of us working in the commercial side of heritage are used to. And I think it also works for academic research as well. It's saying, okay, so kind of what is the point? Who are you trying to communicate with when you're looking at assessing this place or this landscape? Because it's not other archaeologists, it's not other heritage people, it's the people that want to make the change for nature, it's the people who had the if it gets in the way of my nature conservation it doesn't count attitude. So if you start from a position where the story that you can tell about the history of that landscape, and more importantly people in their relationship to the history of that landscape, you put that front and centre, a really catchy, punchy story where everyone go, oh, that's interesting. I kind of thought it was wall-to-wall trees, and then people did something, and then it wasn't. You can start to have present some of that in a more interesting way. So we're trying this in a couple of places. A lot of that myth busting. So the wall-to-wall trees is quite a common one. There was one conversation I heard about the Peak District that I think someone said, "What was it like 1,000 years ago?" Wow, it's really quiet, really a lot quieter, really a lot more trees. You're like, bloody hell, it really wasn't. Like that's an interesting take on things. So people's view of time is really curious. So just taking some time. I also like to wind archaeologists up by saying that by the time you've got a couple of thousand years ago, and going anywhere beyond that, people kind of don't care. It's just all really old, and then there's really, really old. The point is that things have changed. So it's not about us. What are the messages, and how might you dress up what you know in a way that resonates with people? And the main message is things have changed, and people have consistently been managing land and places for the things that they need at that point in time. What do we need now? We need carbon sequestration, we need water quality, and we need nature, and that is why some of these changes are needed. We've got those human stories of places as well. So those past natural processes, they were all affected by people. I mean, the Holocene is just people dicking around with natural processes. So we can kind of help that, as our ecology colleagues love to reinstate natural process. You can go, you know what, where are you talking about? Because if you're talking Holocene, there's always been someone in there somewhere doing something at some point, and we can show that and show when it worked and when it didn't. And also that inspiration for new habitat and landscape. What we're doing now isn't going back. We know that. You can't go back. This is about creating new places that will be resilient and help with the future that we're all facing. But how can that have that kind of thread back through time, and how can we use what we know to help and inspire and engage that? So that's a little part of what we're trying to do. And one of the things that come out of this is sharing information in the right way. So I've kind of dropping some heavy hints. We've got a hard task there. There are people who are really just, why are you even here? What do you even know with your opinions about the past? And I had a interesting and uncomfortable experience at Exeter Uni for a data hackathon thing. And they were like, give us your data and we'll put our environmental science data, I think it was the School of Mathematics. Anyway, they're all experts in data. Just give them some data and a problem and then they'll fix it for you. So we did as we were told. Anyway, it turns out people really massively underestimate the nature of historic environment data, and it turned into a rap. My poor colleague was like, I didn't think I'd be teaching archaeological GIS and heritage records to quite this degree, and at the end of the week we were shattered, and I think all we've managed to do was get a group of highly intelligent people to go, oh man, that's more complicated than we thought it was going to be. And so anyway, I learnt a lot, and this is the babelfish. And the babelfish is, as you know, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It translates things into whatever language you need. We need to find our own babelfish. So the language that we use and the way that we describe things, even the word heritage is understood differently by different people. I had someone once, I was relatively new to the National Trust, say, yeah, I don't think we need to worry the archaeologists with this one because it's outside of the parkland, so I don't think there's anything of any interest there. And I went, oh boy, okay, this is interesting. So that checking in on what people have actually understood, that point about time, I mean, it's an interesting game to play about when people think different things are, because most people really struggle to think back in time over any considerable distance, and once you've gone beyond the Romans, they're like, it's just very old, and that's as far as they can get. But this idea of the tools that we have, which I think offer so much, but they need translating, and the ways in which you can do that's going to depend on the audience, on what people are trying to do, and the sorts of things that you might do. So anyway, that's the need for a babelfish. The other thing that we've been doing that's linked to this assessment, sort of opportunity assessment, is the importance of data. So I've said one of the challenges with peatland is actually we don't often have much data. So that presents its own problems. But where we do, the way you present it becomes really important. And I realise this is actually now a terrible slide for illustrating this. I used this when everyone sat with a laptop and could see it. And anyway, I'll change that for next time. But essentially, we did a lot of work enhancing our historic environment records. And my poor colleague spent ages changing, dots to polygons and polylines, and it's really rich information. And the people at the project went, you've just made it more confusing. There's just stuff everywhere. And you're like, oh yeah, no, it does, doesn't it? That's just like a mess of stuff. And then you can kind of go, well, what we do is like you'd filter it out or phase it. So different colours for different time periods. And then you can start to see a story. I can't actually remember what colour, green's always medieval, right? And red's Roman. But other than that, that's how everyone's minds work. But you can start to tease out those patterns of land use change, and people go, oh yeah, no, that's interesting. I can see that now. And we did this at one of our properties, Kingston Lacey. It's on the Stouts, bottom of Cranbourne Chase. Really amazing prehistoric archaeology, very cool Roman stuff. And actually the field patterns, so they've got those sort of ladder field systems that run up from the river up into the higher ground that persist through time. And we used the sort of chronology to tell a story from it's really bloody confusing, everything's everywhere. And they went, oh wow, that is the same as our tenancies. So all the tenant farms still had a very similar structure that they would have had pretty much from the Neolithic in that landscape. And that was a hook that had that property going, oh, that's really cool. And then another thing that I've been playing around with is how do you put an ecological lens on those data? So this one is just anything that sticks up above the ground. Ecologists love talking about texture. That seems to be quite a trendy word. So it sticks up, that's giving you texture to a landscape. It's a physical thing. It also turns out that's quite important for trying to explain to people what they expect to see. Does it stick up and can I see it? Is a fairly fundamental starting point if you're trying to encourage someone to look and understand what they're looking at. It's weird how we've never really thought about that as archaeologists. And then I got a bit more niche, and this is all of the features that have potential for bryophytes and lichens, basically because they're bits of old stone. So if you've got old brick and stone, it's been knocking around for hundreds, thousands of years, it's highly likely to have some quite interesting bryophyte and lichen communities on it. If it doesn't, then you could probably manage it in a way that it might do. So that was just another way of kind of putting a lens. That idea of the Babel fish can sometimes be the data in the way that we present them. But yeah, this is the peatland conundrum. So most of what we're talking about actually has no known archaeology on it. So where it does, you can do all of that. It's all fun. You can kind of think about how you might mitigate those, don't do any harm, don't dig any holes in that bit because we know that bit's special. But when we haven't got any of that, do we just back off? So this is what we're finding, a lot of the time. Well, there's any archaeology there, so we won't involve you. Now, I'm really nosy and I like to get involved in everything. So I didn't find that very satisfying. And I noticed there's also a little bit of a trend for people are starting to clock that paleo-environmental stuff's kind of cool. You can talk about the ecology of the past, the ecological communities of plants and animals and processes and that kind of thing. And you're like, that's all really cool. But we can put the people in that. We can put on our archaeology goggles and go, right, actually, that core, I can tell you a story of that core, because those changes that you can see relate to what we know what was going on in the wider environment, either down the road or even much, much wider. And that's incredibly powerful. People are really self-centered, even the ones that say they aren't. These sorts of, all of this, the kind of concern for nature and climate, you really, really scratch away at it. It's actually about us, isn't it? It's about our own bloody survival. So most people get quite interested if there's something about people that gives them that connection and relevance. It's also really critical in a world where there's a lot of division between, the rewilding conversations, the people are the problem, we'll just take people out of the situation and then we solve it, versus the people who get really crossed and upset by that because they think it's just a load of tree huggers or whatever. And it can be quite a divisive way of talking about things. If what we do is put the people back into those landscapes and those environments, we're also enabling people to be part of that future as well and recognising that we have a role to play. And I think that's actually quite powerful for bringing together some of those sometimes sort of opposed perspectives. So we've been looking at some of the ways that we might do this and sort of looking at particularly at some of the techniques that can tell us about those past environments, but also challenging, this is one of the things we're doing, that opportunities scoping assessment, challenging people to say, if you could apply these techniques to this landscape, what might it tell us and how might that help in delivering places for nature or engaging people in those stories? And the other thing is an awful lot of these places are anthropogenic. They are there as a result of people's activity, and we know that there's, if you want to really provoke people, you kind of say, give me a habitat and that isn't anthropogenic, because it's actually quite hard. So that's one of the ways that we can do it. So I was thinking, if that core, because that's what I tend to say, is single core in a place where there was never been one before, and you could still tell a story. You'd be twitching because you'd want more evidence and dating and all sorts of fussy detail, but you could still give it a go, even if all you had was the core in front of you, and that's very powerful. So there's a number of things that we can do in particular. So one of them is that contextualising change. So I did some work previously at Historic England with an anthropologist who hung out on the East Coast, and it was in the sort of Haysborough, Pakefield area. Now, those of you that know that bit of coast, that's receding at a rate of knots, 10 plus metres a year, falling off cliffs. now what we were interested in was how people related to that change, and how did they cope with this loss of, how the church is going to go off a cliff in Haysborough, and possibly in the, living the current people's lifetimes, and how did they cope with that? And one of the things that really surprised us was a number of people said, what we really like is that nothing changes here. It's that sense of continuity. We're like, shit, that's not what you're meant to say. But actually, that's really important. That sense of permanence of what we experience now, and that's why the home post is so powerful. It's really hard to imagine anything different. And even we are living through climate change at a pace that no human has ever lived through before. Does it feel that mad and bonkers, like everything's changing around us? I mean, maybe this year, but generally, I didn't think it would feel quite. I thought it was going to be a bit more dramatic than this, because it becomes normalised. You kind of get used to it. So that contextualising change, helping people understand that things haven't always been that way. What someone's tradition is someone else's modern history, and actually we're very good at that. And that evidence of past lives for human and non-human, and how that interaction between them is really powerful as well. And what you can do, touching some soggy soil, if you've been out with people who've never done that before, and kids, and it's amazing how they go, oh, wow, what, that's, however old, or how can you tell that from that? It really is magic. And making that tangible, that it's below the ground, why should I care about it? I can't even see it. I think we really underestimate our ability to do that. Sorry, I'm talking way more than I ever intended to do. I will leave you to pick up with Mark over beer on this one, but this is very exciting from Wickham just this week. A really nice example of that, making that connection with deep time. So this is an oak tree that was there at the end of the Neolithic when the land was dry, and that's kind of mind-blowing when you stop to look, and you can touch that thing that was actually a living tree for a couple of centuries before the inundation and the peat formation and the changes in the ground there. We've also got that idea of unsustainable. So the reason our peatlands are in such a sorry state is because we've been exploiting them. We've been doing things that really weren't a very good idea, it turns out, but at the time it probably seemed like a really sensible idea, burning stuff that's right in front of you. But how you reflect that in terms of, respecting that heritage and sharing the learning from that, and that idea of the consequences of things that might seem like a good idea at the time. Archaeology is like, no one ever learns lessons from the past, let's face it, but we can still hope and try. But that idea, again, of the things have always been this way. Sharing the process, we talked about touching that. There's some lovely examples of this. Is one that Kat Hopwood-Lewis from Natural England sent me of, I've forgotten the name, primary school up north, where there's some fairly controversial peatland restoration. It's under farmland. People think it should be farmland. This might sound familiar for those of you in the Fens. And there's a big programme of peatland restoration, and they've used this sort of engagement has worked wonders for people going, oh man, I never thought that was like what it was like under the ground. So, and then this is you guys at Wickham with the very popular Discover Archaeology Day, which I think we're going to be doing a lot more of. And then there's also the empowering the people actually doing the work. So again, Kat at Natural England, and I think others in Wales and Northern Ireland, Scotland have followed suit with toolbox talks. So the digger drivers, do you need to go and stand there and watch that soggy hole where there's no, there's a limited chance there might be something? Actually, with the right toolbox talks, you can really get the other people involved in that work, the volunteers, to keep their eyes peeled, to learn and to spot things that might be of interest. And they do, and we've had some really great discoveries through doing that. So upskilling other people, because they also care. And that encouraging people to explore. So that's a trackway, I think that's Kinder Pass in the Peak District. But actually that's another thing we've been able to, also through some of the peatland funding, get people out into those places and those sharing those stories. I had 2 case studies, but you don't appear to have fallen asleep yet, so I will rattle through them because that was actually one of the things I wanted to talk about. So there's one from the southwest. So I've mentioned this a couple of times. So Dartmoor Huge peatland project. This has been underway with South West Peat Partnership for, I think it's been evolving over 4 years. So Jim Parry, our archaeologist down there, sent me a kind of brain. I said, send me a brain jump, Jim. And it's been a learning process. I think this is the message overall we just need to restore peatland. What are you guys doing here to, actually, this is kind of interesting. Maybe we could get some money to do some more of this, to really delving into getting additional resource to kind of go a bit above and beyond what the guidance and the funding permits. We've managed to undertake dating on some of these Mylar charcoal burning platforms, which show a Bronze Age activity horizon underneath medieval burning. There's a very extensive landscape of tin streaming. The burning to create charcoal was probably part of the metal working industry, and all of that will be shared as part of the access. This is a National Trust and English Heritage Trust guardianship land, so there's a lot of public access there. But we're also able to delve more into that paleoenvironmental work. So working with Ralph Fife at Plymouth, we've got a little bit more money to start to explore some of the botanical history in particular, which shows far more complex relationships between people and the environment in these places, and starts to really challenge some of the assumptions that ecologists might make about plant communities and things. And we've got there's a lot of challenge in that environment people who believe that the visibility of that industrial heritage is something that needs to be kept as it is. Now, it can't be kept as it is because it is eroded. Doing nothing is just not an option. But actually, the way in which that work's been undertaken has really helped build that case for change and support people in being a lot more comfortable with why those changes might need to happen, and also recording some of those features before they get obscured by planting, etc. And we've learned a lot of lessons. So that dragon scale kind of bunding I showed you earlier might have slightly freaked. That was shared as an example of what they wanted to do, and that the reaction of the archaeologists, I think, audible intake of breath, they learnt a lot about how to actually explain what they want to do and the flexibility that they might have. And then this one is one that you guys are heavily involved with. So I love Wicken, it's such a great place. It was our first nature reserve. It's absolutely entwined with a history of natural history. And it was one of the first places to have a really ambitious 100-year vision of taking over the entire bloody area to turn it all back to Fenland. But Wicken is like at the heart of that. If we can't keep Wicken wet and alive, then that dream dies. So the new bund was essential for undertaking that work. But we've also had many years of really great bits and pieces of community engagement that Shannon Hogan in particular and Angus have been working on in that region. So the Wickham Footprints project that was funded by a National Lottery Heritage Fund, are doing test pits and field walking to engage people with the archaeology of that area. And then the current Seed Fund work with Cambridge that's really starting to delve into some of these issues that I've been flagging about. How do you use that deep time, the paleoenvironmental information, and share that? And the feedback has been extraordinary. I think that both from the staff who were in the, why are you guys here again? To actually, this is a really powerful way of telling a different story and engaging people, improving that access, all those National Trust ambitions, and that connection to place and understanding the change over time and why it matters into the future as well. My other prop, I have a TARDIS that I travel with for when I'm talking to rangers. Anyway, but I would say that's one of our superpowers, is the sort of travelling through space and time. We can go backwards, and we can go backwards. You can also go forwards a bit. So I'd encourage you all to delve into your inner TARDIS when you're dealing with this. What's that? Oh yeah, some lovely photos of things underway. So just sharing the learning. So hopefully it's given you some insights into how we're approaching some really practical challenges. What we've learned, just because you care doesn't mean anyone else will. And that actually really matters if you want to be able to do a lot of this work. But also, most of us do this because we want to make a difference, right? This is, we're not just doing it for kicks. we actually really believe that we can make a bit of a difference. And you have to frame that. You use your babelfish, frame it for other people's agendas. You have to be on it. Like, this is really new territory. No one has done this sort of landscape scale change at, well, I mean, actually maybe the Dutch when they came and drained the fen. But, you know, other than that, several hundred years, this scale of involvement and change for nature is new. We might be experts in archaeology or particular aspects of archaeology or in nature, but we haven't addressed it in this context before. So be honest about that when you're talking to people. They find it a bit disarming, actually. It's quite interesting doing that. We need evidence for the benefits. I talked about what's funded. So certain things are funded. We can get a foot in the door. That's great. That was hard won. I want more, but we need evidence. So the sort of evidence we need to make that case for the benefit of including archaeological approaches to places in these sorts of nature restoration and peatland restoration projects we need that, and then we can demonstrate why it's a no-brainer not to government and to other funders. It's not just government, it's philanthropic funders as well. It's people like Starling Bank give us money for planting trees and for peatland restoration. There's other kind of big donors. So we can make that case, then we will start to be included more holistically. And it's very practical, that into the everyday. It's not just about the spectacular things that you can find when you're doing archaeology in waterlogged places. It's about that single core telling a story that links back to people, and it's about those everyday places. Love it if that archaeological thinking was just automatically embedded into all of these places that we make change. And we need to be confident in translating what we know, and that's a really big ask. So you already know, I hear a lot of people thinking they need training. When I did climate change, people say, I need to go and get some qualifications in climate change in order to engage. You don't. You just need to reframe what you think. Think about, listen to the questions that other people are asking and think, how can what I know support that kind of help them make a difference? And that requires that creativity and imagination. It's my other prop. I've got Dr Who and the Pyramids of Mars. Maybe not that level of creativity, but, maybe not far off. We've sort of done that one, haven't we? I want you to just look at those again, and how are you feeling about them now? It's more of a challenge, but you're up for it. Yeah, I must admit, from when I first heard some of these things, I now go, okay, yeah, we know how to deal with this. So hopefully you do too. Thank you.